Today we're back with the Bill Walton Show, and we want to talk about all things nuclear. Uh, America forever. If there was some nuclear event on the horizon, there would be 24/7 coverage of this in the news and in media. And astonishingly, right now we have events brewing around the world which make World War III loom as a possibility, yet it's getting almost no coverage. And today, want to highlight that and get people focused on what they ought to be paying attention to and what we ought to be doing about it. To talk about it, I've got two men who are fantastic experts in this topic. Sam Faddis, who's is a he's got a long resume. We tried to get it down to something succinct. He's a retired CIA operations officer, and he also is on Steve Bannon's War Room frequently, as most of you know. And we also have Lance Gatling checking in from Japan, where he's lived for the last 4 decades, who's a retired Army foreign area officer and also spent some time with the State Department and in the technology, defense technology industry. So let's get right into it. Sam, why don't you kick us off with what you see as the issues we need to be addressing?
Well, thanks for having me. Look, I think that the challenge is that there are so many issues, right? It's hard to put your arms around them. As you said in your intro, we've walked right up to the line, or run up to the line, or whatever, stumbled up to the line all over the world. We're on the brink with the Iranians. As we're talking, the Chinese have once again encircled Taiwan, and as they're wont to do, are constantly rattling the saber. Putin has threatened to use tactical nuclear weapons. I've lost track of how many times. I mean, we are on the brink of actual nuclear war all around the planet in multiple locations. And folks, remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, at least from history books, and this dominated the news cycle. And oh my God, we could be looking at Armageddon. And today we make no reference to it at all. We pretend it's not happening.
Lance, you pulled together a slide that gives kind of a big picture about who has nukes now around the world. Why don't you? I'm going to pull that up. Pull it up maybe in post-production. Why don't you describe who has them and who potentially has them? And it's a pretty scary picture.
At the peak in the 60s, the United States had over 31,000 nuclear warheads. Everything from gigantic mega city death devices to literally man-packed nuclear weapons that were at the time were 50 to 70 pounds, say call it 8 pounds of plutonium and uranium, where a single individual in a special forces green light unit could be inserted. He could swim in, he could drop in and put that under a motor pool or a headquarters someplace, or we could loft them from the other side of the planet. Those 31,000 are down below 6,000 now. The United States as policy has withdrawn the nuclear weapons, most of them that are on alert. It doesn't take that long to retarget them. Some of that is public relations. It's actually not that big a deal to punch in a series of numbers to a computer, and actually just a feed rather than initializing the inertial navigation system on one of these missiles takes longer than it does to tell it where to go. So Russia has a numerical superiority, if it means anything in such a race as it is. If it means anything, there's actually more in Russia, which gives some people angst. But if you can destroy the world multiple times over, doing it for multiple times over plus one is probably not consequential. Following that, you have England, France, that have a few hundred. China currently has around 400, it's thought. Sam mentioned off camera that people are probably guessing. Of course they're guessing. I mean, they're putting together their best estimate. and you hope that those estimates aren't cooked for political purposes, which is all too often the case these days. If it ever wasn't the case, it was when I was too young and dumb to believe anything other than what I was briefed. We go to India, and it has a number, and the Indian weapons, of course, are only meaningful, primarily meaningful to the Pakistanis and the Chinese. Which is why they have those devices in the first place. Now, how they would deliver them is certainly of great interest to everybody. So you have the South Asia contingent, India, Pakistan, China, which is in Asia, South Asia, all over the place. China's a big place. And has weapons primarily concentrated on the East Coast, looking towards the Pacific, but it also has it out bases all the way out into the desert, almost past Mongolia. And then one thing that's often overlooked is the dual control system within NATO, where the nuclear weapons are stored, maintained by the United States, but there are countries that have signed up to have a say on a council that meets and deliberates whether they're going to use nuclear weapons. And these, I forget the exact wording, but it's something like dual purpose aircraft. So you get a Tornado or the latest version of the English or German fighter, and it's a ground attack aircraft with advanced precision guided conventional munitions, but it can also carry a gravity bomb. B-61, these are big Hummers. These are the ones that get the Russians' attention when they talk about them. They're kept under literally the physical control of the United States military, and having pulled that guard, they're pretty serious about this. So those were scattered around a lot more. Sorry.
Well, then we have the countries that want them very badly, or maybe already have them. Which number one on that list would be Iran. Sam, you've done a lot of work thinking about what they've got or what they don't have or when they might have it.
Well, yeah, look, the first thing to understand is that the Iranians have been working on acquiring nuclear weapons for a really, really long time. They didn't start this last week or last year. This is a decades-long effort. And the other thing to understand is that they hide it and they lie bald-faced about it over and over with a constantly shifting series of ridiculous stories. And they constantly are caught over periods of time with sites that they didn't declare, didn't tell anybody about. And then the inspectors show up and it's clear that there was nuclear material there. But by the time they get there, everything's been moved. And this shell game just goes on and has gone on for a really, really long time. Everybody in the business who talks about proliferation, which is what we're talking about here with the Iranians, would recognize that the really key determiner is the possession of the highly enriched uranium. They're not pursuing plutonium weapons because that's the part that requires the biggest infrastructure that you can detect to actually run this long enrichment process, which we don't need to get lost in. All the rest of the work, the engineering work, which we should keep in mind, right? We cracked the code on this in 1945. So the idea that this is cutting edge technology that only 6 guys in lab coats know how to do is absurd. All of that engineering work can be done at sites that good luck trying to keep track of this. So we have known that the Iranians have been working on the engineering details, the mechanics, all of the detail work for how to actually make a nuclear weapon function, literally for decades. Because, again, without getting lost in physics that nobody cares about, if the thing doesn't function exactly right, it blows up, but it blows up as a conventional weapon. You don't get a nuclear explosion. So the details of how to make this thing actually turn into a mushroom cloud, well, that's the whole game, right? They've been working on that, something that we cracked the code on 80 years ago, for decades. So the idea that they haven't figured that out, or that they're going to wait until they have enough highly enriched uranium to make a bomb to start working on that, is absurd and contrary to all the evidence. In other words, everything we know tells us that in all likelihood, They cracked the code on that and can build the bomb and have been able to build the bomb for a long time. We
Well,
also know
no, I'm sorry, go ahead.
we also know that they have the missiles, not that you can't put these things on aircraft, but they have the missiles that can deliver these things, depending on the size of the weapon, obviously, but presumably they built the missiles with the idea in mind that it would carry these weapons. And they can hit cities in Southern Europe and every city of consequence in the Middle East. So we know that. So now you're down to the question of, do they have sufficient highly enriched uranium, because that's the path they took, to make the bombs? And they've been enriching stuff for years and years and years, and everybody studying the problem will admit, first of all, our intelligence, well, the polite term would be imprecise. In most cases, we're blind. And they are, you hear people these days say they're 2 weeks or 3 days or something like this away from having the material they need.
Well,
that
Lance,
means they're there.
Well, Lance, you showed me a picture that we're now going to put into our slide deck of somebody in the 60s, 50s or 60s, of special forces operator parachuting out of a plane with nuclear devices strapped to his back and to his legs, presumably going to parachute in someplace and go plant these in a spot where they could be exploded, presumably after the special operator left the scene. If we could build something like that small 60 years ago, 50 years ago, why wouldn't Iran already been thinking about planning something like that inside Israel? And Lance, you want to talk about the technology that might have made that possible?
Sure. The miniaturization of nuclear weapons depends a lot on plutonium, weapons grade plutonium. If you really want to get something small, you go with plutonium, because the plutonium devices are what's in, say, 155 howitzer shell. Okay. Small enough, you think about 155 millimeter. This ain't big, and it's a tapered ogive, has with a boat tail, and there's a tiny plutonium pit, and it's very precisely machined, and it's surrounded by explosive lenses that compress it. In the event of, say, the Nike Hercules missiles that surrounded San Francisco and Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., they had a softball size bisected, chopped up onion looking thing, spherical cones, and the explosive lenses had to be very precisely timed to bring all that together to take that softball sized mass down to about the size of a tennis ball, and then it would go critical. So the big bang that Sam was talking about, it's a high order explosion, not just a chemical explosion, but a nuclear explosion.
How would that compare to, say, a Hiroshima size bomb?
Well, but Hiroshima is a standard rule of thumb. It's 15 kilotons. Okay, Nagasaki with Little Man actually had about the little boy bomb. The Hiroshima device was about 15 kilotons equivalent of TNT. That's a lot of boom, but it had 141 pounds of uranium. A very simple, relatively low tech device. The plutonium bomb only had about 13 pounds of weapons grade plutonium, but it was in this big round cylinder. It's Fat Boy. It's a big mass because it was so complicated. Well, what Sam is saying is that when the Iranians, thank you, went towards highly enriched uranium, they can use a much simpler design that precludes all of that. All right, so they don't have to go through all of this modeling on supercomputers and this and that. You and I, if we could get our hands on 90% plus highly enriched uranium, it is quote unquote weapons grade, and we could just, if we could throw it together hard enough, it would blow up. Now, what happens is if you get two separate subcritical masses together, there's so much energy that evolves, it goes and kind of splits apart. It just falls apart and it splatters everywhere. It's going to kill me and you and everybody else in the room, and a couple of rooms over.
Why wouldn't we think that Iran's already developed that? I mean, it seems to me that
Sam mentioned it before. They're doing this in parallel. All right. So it's kind of like, you're going to make a cake and you're waiting for the flour, but you've got the sugar, you've got the vanilla, you've got the lard, you've got, everything is ready for this flour. All they need now is the flour.
Well, the the Israeli intelligence capabilities seem to vastly exceed the United States. I mean, what do you think Israel knows about what Iran already has? Because they're playing with fire right now themselves. I mean, it's they're going all out to win this, as far as I can tell.
Well, it's probably a Sam question. I think they know everything.
Sam, why don't you take that one? You've done a little bit on.
Well, look, I've worked with the Israelis a lot, and I got all the respect in the world for these guys. And I think it's a safe bet that their collection on the Iranian nuclear program is a heck of a lot better than ours is, particularly at this point in time. But let's also keep in mind that the Israelis are not really 10 feet tall, right? I mean, Hamas just launched a mass invasion a year ago of Israel that they prepared a matter of 2 or 3 miles from the border and managed to catch the Israelis completely off guard. That wasn't 5 guys snuck over the fence. That was thousands of people and an action that had been prepared for a period of time, and literally prepared in areas where the Israeli collection is typically insanely good. I mean, when they blow up a car in Gaza and fire a missile through the window, they not only know they're Hamas, but typically know the full names of everybody in the car, and usually who's in the front seat and the back seat, in my experience. That's how good their collection is. So they screwed up and they managed to miss that. So the idea that it's perfect or we can just all take a nap because the Israelis will let us know, I think that's really nearsighted. We also, just throw into the mix, the Iranians are not on an island in isolation, right? They have longstanding connections to the North Koreans. Well, the North Koreans have nuclear weapons, and we know that as a fact. So are we positing that the Iranians just decided to do all of this all on their own, but asked for no help from the North Koreans? I think that's pretty naive.
Well, and didn't Russia and North Korea just recently form a military alliance and Russia's transferring nuclear technology to North Korea?
Well, they're certainly transferring launch vehicle technology, rocket technology. That's what Kim wants. The good President Kim in the North, he wants to prove that they are a worthwhile high-tech society, that their efforts have been rewarded. He was primarily focused on launch technology. The Russians wanted ammunition. They wanted munitions. They wanted rockets of various sorts. Of course, the North Koreans are very happy to have battlefield testing of their equipment, but mostly what they needed was 152 howitzer ammunition. This stuff is the popcorn of war. When I said I was a military operations officer, we would literally plan campaigns with train loads of 155 howitzer ammunition. People have no idea what that means. An entire train. We didn't measure it by trucks. We had core support in trains that would go someplace and have 400 2.5-ton trucks show up to carry this stuff around the battlefield. All right, so that's what the North Koreans gave, and that's what the Ukrainians apparently got with the drone, because they got lazy and sloppy and they piled it all in one pile instead of spreading it out over 3 or 4 square kilometers, which they should have with that kind of ammunition. So the Russians were looking for ammunition, conventional ammunition. I think the Russians have provided advanced medium-range ballistic missile technology to the North Koreans. If you look at their Hwasong 11 series, it's a solid rocket motor MRBM, a medium-range ballistic missile. That's a big step forward from the old type liquid fueled rockets they had before. That's a big deal. So I think they got that. Now, whether they got nuclear technology, nuclear weapons technology from the Russians, I think they already got it from the Pakistanis. I think they've had it for a long time.
So what about the Russians and helping out with Iran and speeding that along? Sam, you've done anything on that, or either one of you really?
Well, look, we know that there's a connection, and we know that there has been support going back and forth. The question is, if you come down to the nuclear program, again, I think the issue here is collection, right? People are always asking intelligence, what are the Russians doing? What are the Iranians doing? And no intel guy worth his salt wants to ever have the audacity to say, I don't have a clue, because we don't have the collection capability to do it. But unfortunately, that's the wall we bump into. And the Iranian program writ large, you have arrived at a point where I think you have to say, if you're at all prudent and have any common sense left, you have to say, we have to treat these guys as being nuclear capable.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is, in my estimation, if they if they conduct a nuclear test and give you advance notice before they actually put those weapons on delivery vehicles, I think you will be lucky. And I don't think that's the way they would function, because in my experience, the Iranians are smart, right? They are sharp people. They will put functioning nuclear weapons on a dozen delivery vehicles. They will disperse them to locations you don't know all of those locations before they ever tell you we are nuclear capable. And keep in mind, we were talking about the size of nuclear devices here. I keep talking about delivery vehicles, and primarily I'm talking about ballistic missiles of some type, could potentially be drones. But the Iranians also operate a worldwide terror network with groups like Hezbollah that have a very strong lash up with Venezuela, as an example. I don't mean like a couple of Hezbollah guys show up in Venezuela every once in a while. This is a massive relationship. The Venezuelans give Hezbollah full sets of identity documents, false identity. What's that mean? Backstop. What that means is they'll give you a passport, and if you contact the Venezuelan government and ask them, is this guy a legit Venezuelan citizen? The Venezuelan government will say, yeah, he's one of ours. So you got a driver's license, a birth certificate, you got a passport. In other words, they can pass as Venezuelans. We've talked about the size of these nuclear weapons, especially if we start talking about something that's considered tactical, whatever exactly that means.
Well,
these are not particularly large devices. I mean,
let's talk about
so the Iranians have a capacity to move these weapons and put them places around the world that do not all have to involve digging big underground silos like we think of in Montana and putting it on a weapon. And so if they have put all this time and effort into it, they are not going to say to you, next Tuesday we're going to begin the process of going nuclear. They're going to detonate a device in the desert and then inform you that they're already capable of taking out Tel Aviv, and you're going to be left with that fait accompli.
Well, let's talk about. I want to talk about the tactical thing, the tactical piece of this, because people in Ukraine in particular, there was a lot of talk in the last year or two where, well, Russia might use a tactical nuke, or we might do a tactical this or that. But the tactical nukes we're talking about are more powerful than the bombs that blew up Hiroshima, as I understand it. And so this distinction that somehow they're nukes and then they're tactical nukes, I think is a false one. And I'd love to have you guys weigh in on that.
Yeah, I would agree. I would look forward to hear what Lannis has to say about that. But that's why I say whatever tactical means, because 100%, you would find people that tell you that the bomb that took out Nagasaki or Hiroshima, in terms of yield, constitutes a tactical nuclear weapon. Yeah. Well, not to the very considerable number of people it vaporized or killed in one other way.
Yeah. So the most modern devices are essentially dial-a-yield. Yield being the effect of the bomb, the relative effect, just for the explosion part. Doesn't count radiation and fallout and everything else. Just for explosion, the yield of a nuclear device. And the modern ones can be actually dialed, and usually have like 3 levels. And by the way, I have no clearances in this world. Um, what I did know when I did have clearances in this world was how to use them, not how they worked. Okay, they didn't want people like me knowing anything about what went on inside. It was just push this button and pull this string. Okay, but we had to plan for the employment of tactical nuclear weapons, and you could actually say, well, I want a yield of this size on this target. Why? Because if I have some massive effect on a city or a maze of rocks or whatever, I don't want to have to go around it. I just want to get the effect that I want in a very precise point. To Sam's point, whether you call it tactical or intermediate theater, regional, whatever, it doesn't matter when you're on the receiving end of one of these things. I actually did some calculations that I could sit here in my office, and if the North Koreans hit the Capitol, the Parliament building in Tokyo, which is only about 4.5 kilometers from my apartment, if I wasn't facing the window and it wasn't an airburst, I'd hear it, and life would certainly change, but I wouldn't be killed. But it would kind of ruin the day of many people for about 3 kilometers in that area.
Well, we're going to put up a slide that shows I hear about North Korea and their nuclear capability and never really realized that Japan is like 100% vulnerable to whatever North Korea decides to do. But I got to think about your life living 4 kilometers, 4 blocks or 4 kilometers from the head of the government. So I've got an extra reason to worry now.
Yeah, I used to say the safest place for me was standing in the Diet, the Parliament building, because one of the reasons you really want to discuss having nuclear weapons on this sort of device is that they're not necessarily that accurate. If you want to spend $1 zillion like the United States did, you get a Trident missile which has a circular error probability of about 100 meters, and you put a big honking warhead on it, you can do a lot of things. You can dig in, you can destroy underground facilities or whatever. But the Iranians, I think, telegraphed a lot of information when they sent this last launch, and they hit that Israeli Air Force base, the name of which I forget, but it's like 90% the size of Manhattan, and it looks like the CEP was about 1 kilometer, which means that they hit one building by accident, and they probably had landed, it didn't have intercepted 32 missiles, and out of them, one hit a useful military target. So that's not a good record, but it's high explosives, right? Or it's some kind of improved conventional warhead, runway penetrators or scattered bombs, area denial weapons. But if you put a 15 kiloton nuke on there, as we used to say in the Army, close enough is good in horseshoes, hand grenades, and nuclear weapons.
Sam? React?
And obviously there's a million variables here, but another thing to just throw in here sort of technically is the question of how is the nuke going to detonate? In other words, how is it designed to detonate? So most people think of an artillery shell and it hits the ground and it blows up. Okay, well, that may be true, but not all projectiles or weapons are designed that way. And with nuclear weapons, it becomes a big issue when you start talking about damage, right? Because if it is designed to function as an airburst and blow up a certain altitude above the ground, then you essentially, if you can think of this just very simplistically as a sphere, the explosion, right, you potentially are getting a broader radius of destruction. On the other hand, if the thing detonates when it hits the ground or below ground, you may not get the same blast radius, but what you're going to get is what people have probably heard of is a lot more fallout. You're going to blow the earth and what used to be buildings and people and everything else up into the air, but that stuff is now irradiated and it's going to drift with the prevailing winds, and there are a million variables here. So this all matters when we talk about Israel and the Iranians. Israel's not a particularly big place. After you hit it with a relative handful of nuclear devices, particularly if you design it to, some of them at least, to blow up when they impact, the fallout alone may render Israel effectively uninhabitable. As an interesting sideline, we uncovered information, and this is all out unclassified, some time ago, I'm talking many years ago, that the Iranians were working on what we would call the fusing, right? This whole issue. When does this device blow up? And the information said that they were working on fusing for a nuclear weapon at essentially the same altitude we detonated our weapons over Japanese cities. Now, I don't think that's just a random chance. That tells you exactly what they were working on for at least some of these nuclear devices. They were copying literally what we did to Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And when you get to the point, by the way, where you're working on the fusing of the nuclear device, I think that's a ways down the road. That's not like we're enriching the uranium and maybe 50 years from now we'll have a weapon. We're down to some fine points of how this thing's going to be constructed and detonated.
Right. You would delay that while other technologies advance to your advantage. Miniaturization of electronics, sensors, cheaper sensor, some bariatric sensors, turn rate, accelerometers, all these devices that make a happy system to do that. I would take one exception with Sam, and this is where I'm going to show my superior engineer license here.
You were West Point Engineering, as I recollect.
West Point Ordnance System Engineering.
Okay.
I was a poli-sci major, so I have no turning on the can opener taxes me. So
yeah, and a lawyer, but you can
and a lawyer. So
put your finger yes. on the.
Well, that means I can lie about my engineering experience. That's what that means.
So it's not potentially you have greater effect. This is a very well known effect amongst certain people. Is not widely discussed because it's a real egghead sort of thing. Look at the Mach stem effect, MACH, like Ernst Mach. Mach stem effect is what happened in the Oklahoma City bombing when Timothy McVeigh set off his truck. He accidentally had the right standoff from the Murray Federal Building to almost double the power of the bomb by having it timed so that the two shock waves, the direct shock wave and then the reflection from the Earth's surface, all hit the building at one time. Well, I used to sell the devices that did that. The U.S. military spent a tremendous amount of money in World War II figuring this out with proximity fuses. Okay, so the proximity fuses are set in order to get the most effect out of a 2,000-pound bomb or a nuclear device or whatever. I think that the concerns about fallout are a bit overcooked. It's certainly an issue, and it's exactly correct. If you hit the ground and you blow up more dirt and debris and concrete dust that gets irradiated, then that is the definition of fallout, whether it's dangerous or not. But in terms of burrowing nuclear weapons, that is hard. That is not trivial, as we used to say. Why? Because you've got this very complex device, and you're going to slam it into the ground or into a piece of concrete at Mach 2 or 3 or 5 or whatever the missile is flying at, or some guy schleps it in and brings it in his Toyota. It doesn't matter. The point is, you can't slam it into something hard without the fear that you break something and you end up with a pop instead of a big bang. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. And, one of the reasons I wanted to do this show was that I wanted to make people aware that this nuclear potential was pretty scary. But after listening to you guys for half an hour, I'm terrified. Well, the different ways that we could, end humanity seem endless, and it's let's shift a little bit more back to the geopolitical piece. Ukraine, Russia, where that is, it looks like Russia's sort of finally overwhelmed Ukraine. And yet there's still talk about long-range missiles going into Russia. Shouldn't we ought to give them that? Doesn't that seem like it's going to, Putin, while he was very aggressive going into Ukraine, seems to have a lot of forbearance when it comes to, maxing out and what they could do with their nuclear capability. What's that theater of war look like to you?
Shall I take lead?
Yeah, go ahead. Whichever, jump in. I mean, you guys are both great.
Well, look, let me throw out a couple of, I don't know if they're disclaimers or caveats up front. First of all, I'm no friend of Vladimir Putin's. I think he's a thug, and he's got a fantasy about reconstituting the old Soviet Union, and on some level, he got what he deserved going into Ukraine. I'm also a big believer, as is, I think, a President Trump, that from our standpoint, our goal ought to be, let's negotiate an end to this thing and shut this thing down and end this war. From an American national security perspective, it ain't helping us. And there's a lot of danger of this thing spiraling out of control. Putin regularly threatens to use specifically tactical nuclear weapons, again, whatever exactly that means. Is a certain amount of that bluster and hyperbole and him beating his chest, without question, right? I don't think it's wise of us to assume that that's all it is, right? The Ukrainians are bleeding to death in this war, but the Russians have taken massive casualties as well. They're pulling T-62 tanks out of storage to send to the front. Okay, I was an armor officer long, long ago. If I had seen a T-62 tank on the battlefield in my old M60A3, that would have been an easy day. We would have stacked those up as burned out hulks, killing them 2,000 yards out when they couldn't even see us. In other words, they were grotesquely obsolete, a little bit better than World War II technology at that point in a whole variety of ways that we don't get lost. So the idea that you're pulling those things out and throwing them on the battlefield, 40 years later, that's pretty sad. But what he does have completely intact is his nuclear arsenal. We could have all sorts of discussions about how many guys he's gotten killed and all the other degradation to his conventional arms and where he's getting everything. His nukes are intact. And we know for sure that they have had some very serious discussions in Russia about the possibility of doing things, for instance, that essentially constitute a warning shot of a tactical nuclear weapon at a relatively uninhabited area in Western Europe, however they define that, because at this point, NATO has expanded so far east, as a mechanism for saying, no, for real, back off, guys. Again, no friend of his, and not taking everything that Putin says at face value by any stretch of the imagination. But when you get to this point, it probably suggests that somebody ought to seriously be thinking about how many wars have we seen in history that spiraled out of control? And in retrospect, people are trying to figure out exactly how that happened. 1914 is the classic example, right? So this is a very, very, very real danger to me. And we ought to be doing something about it, which is back to the baseline. We ought to be getting these guys to the negotiating table, which, by the way, I don't think is that difficult of a process. I mean, and if nothing else, Donald Trump ought to know how to negotiate, right? Look at Vladimir Putin and say, look, brother, we can do this all day. You're bleeding to death and I'm not taking any casualties. All I got to do is keep writing checks. And look at Zelensky and say, unless you plan on fighting this war without us, you will sit down at the table and we're going to have a discussion. Do I think that will be resolved in 5 minutes? No, but I don't think it's
I wholeheartedly agree with you. And that's one of the reasons I'm all in for Trump. I have this image of Kamala sitting across the table from Putin. And, I think 60 Minutes would have to intervene to edit what she was saying to him to make her sound more credible. And I don't think they could even do that. So
right.
In terms of leadership choices, when it comes to avoiding getting killed, it's 100 to 0 in terms of which way you've got to go. Hey, Lance, you got a point of view about this?
I tend to leave the politics to the politicians if they leave me alone, but unfortunately they don't.
Well, I spent a lot of time doing politics, so don't leave it up to me. I want to hear what you have to say.
Well, on the political side, I think you're both right. You have it right. It's a waste of humanity. It's a waste of treasure. It's a waste of time. It's the Ukraine will never recover. It'll be a rump state with 10 million people who aren't going back because there's nothing to go back to, right? The biggest export for Ukraine for the next couple of decades will be marriage age eligible women. It's an unmitigated disaster in all dimensions.
Hadn't the population already dropped from like 40 million to 20 million?
It started that way. It's probably more like 30 now.
Okay.
They've literally lost at least 10 million, either families or young men that have beat feet across. They're in Japan. I see them all the time. They're in Mongolia. They're everywhere. They're everywhere. They're hardworking people in a horrible situation. They had set up a very bright future. They'd set up a very bright idea. They were going to focus on IT, and they became the IT back room for most of Europe because they're multilingual. They work hard. They learn quickly. I worked with the Yuzhnoye and Yuzhmash, the inventors, the designers, the testers, and the manufacturers of the Cuban missiles, the actual missiles that went into Cuba, the Satan, the SS-18 that stopped Ronald Reagan cold in his tracks, and they went to the real SALT talks. And I worked with those guys. They were brilliant engineers, hardworking people, ready to do business, trying to figure out their way in a new world. And this whole thing has just been insane. So I'm all for that, but what you're talking about is breaching what's called a nuclear threshold, and there have been more brain cycles spent on that than probably any question in the Western world, except for how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, because there are no answers. What happens when you cross the nuclear threshold? Almost inevitably in the war games that run in the Pentagon with testosterone-filled American generals or whatnot, it escalates. And it ends up with some exchange that nobody wins. People like to quote Sun Tzu from the Bienfa, the art of war, and they always quote the wrong stuff. One of my favorite quote from Sun Tzu is, "No country has ever benefited from a protracted war." Period. Right? So everybody loses by a protracted war. And this goes back to the Chinese. Are the Chinese going to attack Taiwan? No, because it becomes a protracted war. They're not going to win immediately. There's going to be stalemate. So right now the stalemate has to go, but the nuclear threshold that they're talking about, you have nut jobs in every culture, in every organization, and the nut jobs say, well, let's just put on a small demonstration of a 155 or a Katyusha, or no, sorry, one of their medium range tactical missiles. Let's just blow up something we occupy. Let's just make a big hole in our front line. And it doesn't work that way, okay? Because once you cross that, then everybody else is going to start ratcheting up. So hopefully no one will be so insane as to do that.
Well, we all hope that, but we're counting on the forbearance of Vladimir Putin and not our own talented, intelligent, wise members of our administration, which seem to be, they're acting like children. I feel like we're in seventh grade. Tony Blinken says, well, we're just going to ignore Putin. We're going to spurn him. Well, good luck with that, guys. I mean, we have children playing with fire.
Well, it's not like you have a choice. People constantly will try to claim that Trump dealt with the mafia. Well, anybody that does anything in New York City has to deal with the mafia. If you open a restaurant in Tokyo, you have to deal with the Yakuza, the Japanese organized crime. They don't leave you alone. No one's going to leave you alone. So the notion of not engaging Putin is just insane to me.
Well, I have a story, quick story. I used to be a banker and was Jay Pritzker's banker, and he was in a deal with Donald Trump. And we went to visit the casino in Atlantic City they were building. And I was a kid, actually, I was just a few years younger than Trump. But I went up and they didn't have any walls in, they just had the floors and the steel beams. And I looked across the expansive floor and it just was waving up and down. And I said, so why don't we have a level concrete floor? And they said, well, that's a mafia floor. Because they control they control
in Atlantic City, in New Jersey. Imagine.
Oh, we were surprised. I'm shocked. The mafia is going on in this casino.
To me, a Southern boy, when I went to West Point, I went to New York, and it was like a different world. Everybody's talking about the union. I thought they were the mob. The union, you have to go to the union to get a card to work as to hump bricks on a construction site. I went, who are these people and how do they enforce these rules? No, they're the Democrats. There they are.
Hey, we talked about the fourth flashpoint. We touched briefly on the other two. Just let's swing towards China, Taiwan. I'm in the camp that thinks, and I think Sam, you've analyzed this as well, and you live there. Not Sam, but Lance. I think the odds of something happening where China tries to go into Taiwan are quite low. But nevertheless, China's got 400 nukes already, and maybe 10 times that amount. We don't know, but it seems like they'd have zero interest in using that kind of weapon with Taiwan.
Well, that's my general impression. Is that once again, it cannot be won quickly. If you look at the history of World War II and Operation Overlord and the terror, the stark terror of the Allied commanders that they would get caught crossing the Pas-de-Calais and the English Channel, which is what I forget, like 18 miles wide at the narrow point or something. It's not much, right? Well, the Taiwan Straits are 150 miles. There's no place to hide. You can only come ashore in a handful of areas on the western shore of Taiwan. And when you do, you're faced with either a mountain or an urban area where you wouldn't want to drive through. A conventional invasion of Taiwan, to me, is almost unthinkable, right? Doesn't mean they're not going to use that notion to whip up their own forces and to, be strong. I've had commanders who were, the same way. I mean, most of them never really thought we're going to go, take our bayonets and go attack the North Koreans in their sleep. But it was certainly a way to rile up the troops and get people to work hard and everything else. And you've got domestic audiences that read that, and it's useful to whip up public sentiment against the Japanese or the Taiwanese or whatever. But you look at what happened to our economy, the destruction, the losses in our economy with our own shutdown, much less being bombed or whatever. And the density of Taiwan is hard for people to understand. Those chips that we need, and we do need them, come from very dense industrial parks.
Right on the shore that faces China. And the advanced semiconductor business, the whole world depends on what's going on in Taiwan. It's in nobody's interest to see that destroyed.
When I was in a certain large U.S. chip manufacturer that was offshoring as quickly as possible, I was in the defense group that was 16,000 people in a 150,000 person company. And they were offshoring advanced chips as fast as they could. And I asked one of the senior VPs coming out of the military and the State Department, I thought, did Washington actually okay this? I mean, did anybody actually ask the question? He goes, Lance, they're all doing it. If we don't do it, we're going to be behind the eight ball, and all of our competition is doing it. And what are we going to do? Do you have an alternative? No, I didn't, but I went and visited the place, and it is the goose that lays the golden egg, but the infrastructure that's required to make that happen is so complex. If you think getting an electric vehicle out of China, rare earth magnets, permanent magnets, AC, DC, whatever, converters, all the electronics, and the lithium, you think that's complicated. It's nothing compared to what the technology that comes together into that chip that runs your iPhone or your supercomputer, whatever it is, AI, you name it. So, and also the Chinese don't have to do that. There's a Chinese saying that says when to scare the monkey, kill the chicken. Right? You kill the chicken in order to scare the monkey. Why? If you're a monkey trainer and you got your monkey, whatever the Chinese equivalent of an organ grinding monkey is, and he's being recalcitrant, they're pretty intelligent creatures. So you take a chicken, which is going to end up in the pot anyhow, and you kill it very noisily in front of the monkey, and you look at the monkey and say, "Capiche? Do you get it?" And the monkeys tend to fall in line. Well, that's what China is doing, right? They're picking on Philippines, or if they can, they pick on the Vietnamese, who tend to fight back. So the Philippines is a easier, better target because they don't have any advanced military capability. And thankfully, we're not getting too spun up about it, but they pick on them all the time, and they're encroaching on them. And the Taiwanese see that. They don't have to invade Taiwan to control it. Sam may have read The Defense of Duffer's Drift when he was a young Army officer. It's about the Boer War, and a young man has to defend a drift, and he actually goes to the drift. He ends up, he gets killed, and he wakes up. He gets killed. He wakes up. It's like 6 times. He finally realizes, I don't have to sit on the drift to defend the drift. I need to get out up here where I can see it. Well, it's the same thing in Taiwan. They can blockade Taiwan. They've encircled. They can only do it for a short period of time right now. But in doing so, they have to transit international waters in Japan and in the Philippines, and they're very vulnerable to being blocked off from that. So it is not, the Chinese are definitely not 10 feet tall. There's astonishing developments in China. When I was a strategic war planner in Japan, we planned the defense of Japan and the assistance of the defense of Korea. China didn't even have a war plan, as far as I know. I mean, first time I went to China, they had 4 million men, and you couldn't even, in the military, the PLA, you couldn't even say there were men under arms because they didn't have arms. They didn't have enough rifles for every man in the PLA. And look what they've done. It's astonishing. And they did it with our money, honey, which is just, drives me crazy. But it is what it is. And now what are we going to do with it? And it's not going to, like you say, the people in the administration now, they're talking a good fight about the pivot to Asia, but there's not a whole lot there.
They don't have a clue. I mean, that really brings us. I could talk with you guys for days, but we got to wrap this up. Brings us back to our government, our current government, and what we ought to be doing. And it seems like everywhere we look, we're either blundering or deliberately, taking us in the wrong direction. I mean, my favorite stories are John Kerry going to China when we've got all these issues, and his only issue is climate. And then we've got our State Department all around the world flying LGBTQ plus flags to celebrate diversity in countries where if you celebrated that kind of diversity, you'd likely be killed. And yet we're trying to inflict our culture on them. At the same time, we've got all these other issues going, and the world's on fire. It's moving away from us. We've thought ourselves as this sovereign giant that could do anything we want, and I think it's becoming really clear we cannot. So how do we coming back to our original topic? How do you guys think we ought to deal with the nuclear threats all over? How do we diffuse them? And then we'll take it from there. That'll be the subject of our next show. let's do the nuclear ones first, so we can keep it relatively tidy on the big topic.
Well, look, I think, I'm obviously transparently an America First guy. People talk about World War II and the Greatest Generation, and I'm all about that. My dad, when he was 22, was at Okinawa. So, and I grew up on those stories. But what they sometimes forget is, or look past, is how hard-nosed our policy was, realpolitik. I mean, we looked at this war and made a deal with Joseph Stalin for the duration of the war. We armed the Soviet army, right? With that enemy, with clear ideas of the fact that, okay, we're going to have to deal with these guys down the road. But this is about America first, our national security, to defeat Imperial Japan and Italy and Nazi Germany. This is the hard-nosed, very, very pragmatic policy, all focused on us. We'll deal with the Russians down the road. We don't think they're our buddies. But right now, we got to make these hard decisions. You've suggested, and I agree wholeheartedly, not only aren't we making those decisions, but many of the people that are in a position to make decisions, they're not feckless. I mean, they may be feckless and incompetent and all kinds of other stuff, but that's too kind. I mean, when you don't enforce oil sanctions on the Iranians and you let them make $100 billion, it's not true that you don't have any clue what the consequences of that are going to be. I mean, every time a missile's fired at Tel Aviv, well, we, one way or the other, gave the Iranians the money to do that. And again, these people are not so stupid that they didn't understand that they were going to pump all this money, not just into missiles, but into the whole terror network, Hamas, Hezbollah, all of that kind of stuff. So to me, it's a question of recentering on that. And then because of those principles, that then drives your strategy. So we were just talking about chips and the fact that, you know, virtually all 85, 90%, whatever it is of the chips that really drive the world economy at this point come out of Taiwan, right? Well, so a coherent national security strategy would say, well, that not let's stop the Chinese from bombing those facilities, but say, I mean, maybe we do that too, but we can't continue to proceed down the road allowing that situation strategically to exist. On the Iranian front, we can't keep letting them sell oil all over the planet and then try to send enough interceptors to the Middle East to stop those missiles. And just kind of, to me, it is always a matter of you have to have a coherent strategy, and then everything is driven for the strategy. To the extent we have a strategy right now, some people call it managing decline. I think maybe even that's too kind, because a lot of these guys, I think have picked a side, honestly, and the side wasn't ours.
Well, and a lot more people get killed in rearguard actions than any other. So, you know, I'm telling you military guys this, but I did my 2 years in the Pentagon, so I'm an expert. As a draftee, I might add. Sam, that was so well put. Lance, I'm going to give you a chance to equal that brilliant summary.
Well, certainly having a strategy is a good thing. Having the right strategy is all important. You might be better off without a strategy if you have the wrong strategy. Certainly, having the enemy inside the wire is not a good place to be. And there are some people that are playing the United States very adroitly. One of my misspent periods in the Army was a psychological operations training, and seeing how it works. And they were thought of as kind of the geeks and whatever for the U.S. Army, but they turned out to be really professional and very good at this stuff. Somebody's doing it to us at multiple levels. And I've asked a variety of folks, who's behind this? And the general answer, I believe, is it's not a single person or a body. It's just like minds heading in the same way. It's like birds homing south. You know, there's no lead bird. It's just, you know, they're all taking the draft behind whoever's in front. He gets tired, he gets replaced by another bird. So strategy is certainly important. Proliferation is a fact. We have to find carrots to go with any kind of sticks, and there are very few sticks that the U.S. has left that are effective. When they've sanctioned everybody in sight, they've weaponized the SWIFT system to try to force people to do things. All they're doing is forcing people into the arms of other systems. Now, whether those systems can pull it off, I have no idea. I'm not, you know, it's not my area of expertise. But I tell you what, I do believe that our lifestyles will change tremendously, and the power, the ability of the United States to generate power will be grotesquely affected if that goes through. And particularly with the sort of mindset in Washington now is you spend everything plus whatever you can steal from the people, and then something happens and there's no surplus. What do you do? There's no surplus in people that are competent. There's no surplus in budget. There's no surplus in equipment. We can't maintain the equipment for the fence, the border fence. So we'll sell it for pennies on the dollar. I mean, it was fencing material. It's supposed to sit outside. Leave it alone until somebody else comes along and plants it in the ground. And no. We're gonna get rid of it all. So somebody's gonna come along and have to replace all of that too. I would say that one thing about it is chipping. Sam has questions regarding the U.S. ability to do stuff. One of the things that is always interesting to me is these countries that are forced to get all of their equipment off the black market somehow. Accelerometers, chips, you name it. Every Russian advanced platform has a U.S. chip in it. Well, it doesn't take a genius, because I figured it out. If you could chip those, if you could put in fake chips that have a certain parameters built in where they stop working on Easter Sunday or whatever. Acceleration is this, or it gets a feed from accelerometer that this is happening in the aircraft, and all of a sudden you turn off the engines, or any number of things like that. I probably had some poor North Korean logistics guy had his fingernails yanked out when I said this in the Foreign Correspondents Club in Japan. That there's no way to tell. They would never be able to recover the rocket from the missile from the bottom of the Sea of Japan to see if it was actually someone in the supply chain. I actually tried to get a missile systems engineer, a friend of mine. We're going to write an article on the 1,000 things you could do to screw up somebody's missile if you could get inside their supply chain. You'd never demonstrate, you'd never tell the world you had it. But why? Because if they're going to some Chinese guy selling them advanced electronics for the North Korean missiles, well, he's doing it on the quiet. He's taking cash, whatever. He'll take our cash too, right? So if you were inside that circle, you would never tell until the world came down. This is sort of the Israeli notion. And as you said, they like Deus ex machina. You cannot spend too much money on the technical side of things. So they like to spend money on the technical side. They don't like to have bodies on the fence. They didn't like to have bodies in the human shop. And when Jimmy Carter's Stansfield Turner told all those guys that we were out of the human business because we have satellites, and I went, I got a tent. I mean, can you tell me what's going on inside my tent? No. So you can get too carried away. And here are the Israelis with all the money we give them, 3.8 billion a year plus billions for Iron Dome and Arrow and everything else under the sun. And they didn't have enough conventional ammo to fight Hamas. What's wrong with this picture? Speaking of strategies, that's the wrong strategy. It did give them a lot of high-tech industries you could talk about with George Gilder, but it didn't help them when Hamas came through the wire.
Well, that's why we need American leadership again. And to end on just a political note, I'm familiar with a lot of the people that Trump wants to bring into his administration, and they understand the issues that we've been talking about for over an hour, and they understand a lot more. And I think we've got some reason for optimism if we can see a regime change here and bring this about. So anyway, you guys were extremely interesting, all these topics. So Lance Gatling and Sam Faddis, I can't wait to have you back on the show to talk about the next big issues. So we'll wrap it up. Sam, where can we find you? In addition to being on Steve Bannon's War Room a lot.
My wife and I, she's also a retired case officer, run a magazine called And Magazine at Substack, andmagazine.substack.com, and that'll take you to where we are in social media and everywhere else.
It's a terrific magazine, and I'd recommend being a paid subscriber. Lance, you're in Tokyo. That's we can find you approximately knowing that. But where can we find you in the digital world?
I tend to stick with the podcasts of friends and colleagues. I don't write a lot. I don't publish that. What I've spent the last 20 years doing is studying the history of Japan in the interwar period, the creation of modern Japan and how they got drug into a war that destroyed them, where most of the people knew it would end them, and how
Yeah.
they did it
Yeah, they did.
anyhow.
They
And I
did
see
it
the
anyway.
parallels with today, and it's really striking. And that's called the Kano Chronicles, Kano Chronicles. And I should have a book coming out in a year or so about how these people, brilliant, educated, and fully aware that they were probably all going to destroy the country, still did it.
Well, on that note, I won't describe it. Thanks, Sam and Lance. This has been the Bill Walton Show, and if you're watching at this point, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Encourage your friends to do the same. You can find us on all the major platforms and Substack as well, and we're also on CPAC now every Monday night. And anyway, so if you like this conversation, want to hear more like it, we'll talk soon. Take care.